Hello everyone. I've been asked multiple times to make a guide on how to do DPS as a tank, but it's actually a very complex subject that would take a lot of time and the setup would vary greatly depending on the class, the type of content, etc. But I decided that even if I can't get it 100% right, I'll give it a try. And I'll explain the thought process behind the setups I use while scorepushing Maw of Lorkhaj. You will not find a ready to use build here. The builds I've used are tailored specifically for the group I was running with, and specifically for the fight times we were getting, which is why this video will be focused on the thought process of making a build, rather than the build itself. So you can use this knowledge to make a build that will suit you and your own group, and just learn something new in general. Just so you know what to expect, the best parses I've achieved during our progression were 122k DPS on Zhaj'hassa, 120k DPS on Twins, and 56k DPS on Rakkhat. So, let's get started. Gear and skills change between bosses, so let's start with the stuff that doesn't change. The class choice. There's a few reasons why sorcerer is the best option here. The streak ability makes it very good for stacking trash. This is obviously irrelevant for the topic we're talking about, because I'm only covering bosses in this video, but this is a big reason why I had to choose sorcerer for the score push. The minor prophecy buff. The group needs at least one sorcerer or nightblade to provide either the minor prophecy or minor savagery buff, which are more or less the same thing nowadays with the hybridization. You don't want sorcerer or nightblade damage dealers because arcanists are simply better right now, so the duty of providing one of these crucial crit buffs falls on the tank. The Atronach synergy. Another reason why you need to have at least one sorcerer in the group. This ultimate provides a synergy that grants everyone in your group Mage or Berserk for 10 seconds, increasing damage done by 10%. And combined with Pillager's Prophet and Crypt Cannon's Vestments, you can use it twice even in a very short fight, which provides a really good uptime of Mage or Berserk. Boundless Aegis. The most deadly mechanic you'll encounter in VMO as a tank is Rakkhat's Dark Parse ability, during which he channels a heavy hitting attack that damages you over 5 seconds. This damage is blockable, so the best way to deal with it is by getting as much block mitigation as you can. Sorcerer's Bound Aegis gives you additional 40% block mitigation for 5 seconds, so it's perfect for dealing with that mechanic, and it allows sorcerers to spec even more into damage, where other classes would have to spec way more into defensive, in order to survive the attack. Now let's take a look at other parts of the build that had to stay the same throughout all the bosses. The race. I started this progression as a Nord, simply because this is the character I normally use for tanking, but also because I thought the armor would be necessary for Rakkhat's Dark Parse, because during our previous VMO score push, I had some trouble surviving it. This time, after some improvements to the build I used against Rakkhat, such as fitting in the revealing flare, I felt like I could sacrifice some survivability for damage, so I race changed from Nord to Dark Elf, to gain the weapon damage passive and a bit more stamina and magicka, at the cost of health, armor and ultigen. Another thing that cannot be changed between bosses are your attributes. In the previous progression, due to the issues of surviving Rakkhat's beam, I decided to go with 32 points into health and 32 points into stamina. But this time I managed to get away with investing all of my 64 points into stamina. The best modus for DPSing is the Thief, which increases your critical chance, and it's especially good for us, because with our semi-tank setup we'll have much lower crit chance to begin with. Okay, so let's move on to boss specific stuff. Starting off with Zhaj'hassa the Forgotten. It's a fight where you won't be taking much damage unless the small cats decide to randomly aggro on you. But it happens so rarely it's not really worth adjusting for it. The food I used is sticky pork and radish noodles, which gives max health and max stamina. I did try food with just max stamina and it didn't end well. I used heroism potions in order to be able to cast 2 Atronach ultimates in a single fight. As for item sets, I had to wear Nazarai, Pearlescent Ward and Alkosh. Nazarai is there to extend multiple debuffs, but most importantly the Major Brittle, applied by the Nunatak set, so that the group could reach crit damage cap without Major Force, which allowed us to completely drop the Saxil's Champion set. Pearlescent provides a small bonus to everyone's weapon damage, but it's also a nuisance because it has to be double barred, which forced me into wearing at least 2 heavy armor pieces. Alkosh is there for bonus penetration. Normally it's better to put Alkosh on a damage dealer and War Machine on the tank, but in this specific case I had to delay my ultimate for a few seconds, because I had to wait for Nunatak to proc, which takes 4 seconds, which is why I couldn't use War Machine, because War Machine has to be used as soon as possible. As for traits, enchants and weapon types, I could get away with using exactly what a sorcerer damage dealer would use, because I wouldn't be taking much damage anyway, which means I wanted to use as many medium pieces as possible, which is 5 because I was locked into at least 2 heavy armor pieces, because of having to double bar per lesson word. The trait I use on my body pieces is Divines, which increases the potency of the 5th modus, increasing crit chance. The enchants on my body were stamina to boost my DPS. As for jewelry, I went with the Bloodthirsty trait with weapon damage enchants. Due to the low damage I was taking, I could get away with daggers on my front bar and bow on my back bar. And because Alkosh can be front barred, I could fit in an arena weapon set on my back bar, so I went with Maelstrom bow. The traits and enchants I use on my weapons are what you'd use on a regular damage dealer. Nirnhold and charge daggers with poison and flame enchants, and infused bow with a weapon enchantment. Now moving on to skills. Conveniently, the only 3 things I had to provide for my team skill-wise were the Taunt, the Archnag ultimate, and the Conduit synergy. All other buffs and debuffs were covered by other supports. When trying to DPS, Inner Beast is the best taunt, as it grants you a 10% damage taunt buff against the enemy you've taunted. Though there's one constraint that I had to obey while making the skill setup. The score push I'm talking about is from previous patch, so because of the bug with pets stealing important buffs such as Pillager's Prophet, I couldn't use pets other than the Yachnak, which was simply necessary for the Major Berserk. So from that point, I can just fill the rest of the slots with abilities a regular sorcerer damage dealer would use. Crystal Frags, double barred so I could also get procs while casting skills on my back bar, Daedric Prey, decent damage on its own and it also increases the damage of my Atronach, Rapid Strikes, a spammable, Quick Cloak. The reason I use Quick Cloak here instead of Deadly Cloak is because the fight was usually around 28 seconds. So a cast of Quick Cloak right before the boss spawns would last for an entire fight, while Deadly Cloak would inconveniently run out 8 seconds before the boss dies, when it isn't worth refreshing the skill anymore. Camouflaged Hunter. A source of major prophecy since I couldn't get this buff from my potion, because I had to use the heroism potions. Flawless Dawnbreaker. It's there for proccing the Fighter's Guild passive, which increases weapon damage by 3%. Hurricane. Does decent damage and provides major resolve. Endless Hail. Good damage and it procs our backbar enchant. Lightning Flood. The ability itself is rather low damage, but when you count in the damage someone else will do, with the conduit synergy it provides, it becomes worth it. Summon Charge Atronach. The source of Major Berserk I talked about before. I used this morph over the single target one to do more damage on the twins fight. The blue champion points I used were Master at Arms, which increases direct damage, Fighting Finesse, which increases critical damage, Deadly Aim, which increases single target damage, and Exploiter, which increases damage against off-balance enemies. The red champion points were Boundless Vitality and Fortified to slightly increase survivability, Rejuvenation to slightly increase sustain, and Bastion to deal increased damage to Zhaj'hassa's damage shield. But there's one more aspect to the Zhaj'hassa fight. The boss has a really long roleplay phase, which you cannot speed up so you can pre-buff stuff on the ground before it spawns without wasting any time. The skills I pre-buffed were Channeled Acceleration. It can be pre-buffed really early as it provides minor force for an entire minute, Scalding Rune, Barbed Trap, and Daedric Tomb. These traps are popping exactly when boss spawns, so they're really good for pre-buffing, as they won't lose any value even though they're cast long before the boss spawns. Shadow Silk. Somewhat similar to the traps. This skill isn't a damage over time, it simply explodes dealing all of its damage 10 seconds after it was placed, which is why it's good here. Just placing it no earlier than 10 seconds before Zhaj'hassa spawns allows me to get the skill's full value. Elemental Blockade. Even though it's a dot and it loses value the earlier we pre-buff it, it can still deal really good damage because I was briefly swapping my Maelstrom bow to Maelstrom staff during the pre-buff. Anti-Cavalry Caltrops. Same logic as with Elemental Blockade. It's much weaker than Blockade, but I had free time for one more skill cast. The biggest DPS I achieved on that fight was 122k, and now I'll show you the footage of it. Now moving on to twins, Vashai and Skinrai. This setup will be much less optimized than others because we did some gear changes on the last day of our progression, and I simply didn't get the chance to fine-tune it. Just like with Zhaj'hassa, it's a fight where I mostly ignored my survivability because I wasn't taking much damage. Once again, I used sticky pork and radish noodles food and heroism potions. As for item sets, I had to wear Nazarite, Saxhleel and War Machine. Noon attack wouldn't have been practical here, which is why we needed Saxhleel this time. And because of that, I didn't have to delay my ultimate anymore, so I could also use War Machine. As for traits, nothing changes compared to Zhaj'hassa Setup. Instead of a bow, this time I had to use a lightning staff to proc off balance, so everyone could make use of the exploiter champion point. I also had to use the crusher enchant instead of weapon damage enchant, because there are 2 bosses in that fight, so a crusher enchant just from the healer wasn't enough. And I could use 7 medium pieces this time, because I wasn't being limited by the use of pearlescent ward. This time, instead of front barring one of the sets, I backbarred Saxhleel's champion, so I could fit in a 2-piece weapon set on my front bar. And I went with Black Rose dual wield, which increased my damage down and reduced my damage taken by 6%. Now let's see what's different in terms of skills. For the first 10 seconds of the twins fight, before we get assigned any color, we can damage both bosses. So for a little bit less than half of the fight, it will be an AoE fight. Which is why instead of single target rapid strikes, I went with silver shards, which will damage both bosses. Another change is that instead of having crystal fragments on my back bar to increase the amount of procs I'd get, I instead went with cavalry caltrops, because another AoE dot should do better than more procs on a single target ability, but also because I couldn't pre-buff caltrops in this fight, because twins don't roleplay before spawning the way Zhaj'hassa and Rakkhat do. Since I swapped my bow to a lightning staff, I had to change Endless Hail to Elemental Blockade. As for champion points, the only differences compared to the Zhaj'hassa setup are that I changed Deadly Aim to Biting Aura and Bastion to Sustained by Suffering. The biggest DPS I achieved on that fight was 120k, and now I'll show you the footage of it.
3, 2, 1.
Switching.
There we go. We got video, we can pull off.
Be fed.
And now the last boss, Rakkhat. Here things get a bit more interesting, because we won't be using something that's basically a damage dealer setup with a taunt. Rakkhat deals moderate amount of damage throughout the fight, and he also has an ability called Dark Barrage, which deals massive amounts of damage. Fortunately, this damage can be mitigated by blocking, so Sorcerer's Bound Aegis is perfect for countering it. In this fight I couldn't get away with a food that grants max stamina. It was very hard to sustain, so I had to use Orzorga's Smoked Bear Haunch, which grants max health, stamina recovery and magicka recovery. I couldn't fit in Camouflage Hunter on my skill bar anymore, so I had to use Spell Power Potions as a source of Major Prophecy. The item sets I had to use were Nazarite, Pearlescent Ward and War Machine. Pearlescent forces me into at least 2 heavy armor pieces, which is my chest and legs were heavy. Then I had 3 medium War Machine armor pieces, and on Nazarite I used 1 medium and 1 light armor piece. The reason is that survivability cannot be completely ignored in that fight, so I wanted to trigger the Undaunted command passive by having all 3 armor types. I used reinforced traits on my heavy armor pieces and on my medium helmet to increase my survivability a bit. On the rest I used divines. This time, instead of using just stamina enchants, I used a few tri-stat enchants to improve survivability and sustain, because I will be making use of that additional magicka. For jewelry, nothing changes compared to previous fights. As for weapon types, I couldn't get away with dual wielding anymore. I had to use an ice staff to get the block mitigation from the Ancient Knowledge passive in order to survive Dark Barrage. The trait I used on my ice staff was Precise, because I thought it would be best since my crit chance was very low. I don't know if it was the best choice. I probably should have tried Nirnhound, but I forgot about it and I only noticed this when making this video. Same oversight happened with Enchant. I used a Fiery Enchant even though Poison would have probably been marginally better. On my back bar I once again used a bow with Infused Weapon Damage Enchant. Now moving on to skills. I'll be drawing comparisons to the Zhaj'hassa setup. The spammable I used this time is Destructive Reach, because I couldn't use Rapid Strikes anymore due to the weapon I used. For the same reason I couldn't use Quick Cloak anymore. and I used Bound Aegis in that spot. I needed even more survivability than this, so I replaced Camouflage Hunter with Revealing Flare, which would grant me 10% damage reduction and 10% magic recovery, helping with both survivability and sustain. Without Camouflage Hunter, I wasn't getting passive Major Prophecy anymore, so I had to use Spell Power Potions instead of Heroism ones. To further increase my survivability, I replaced the Bugbear Crystal Fragments with Critical Surge, which did a lot of healing. The pre-buff on this boss is pretty much the same as the one in Zhaj'hassa. As for champion points, the only difference compared to Zhaj'hassa Setup is that I changed Bastion to Bracing Anchor. The biggest DPS I achieved on that fight was 56k, and now I'll show you the footage of it.
Middle.
Barash.
Help gärna Margaret. It's staying on the pad. It's so private, aren't you, when you get the wings?
And that's it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments or in our Discord server Wildheart, which I encourage you to check out. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel and check out my Twitch. Thanks for watching and see you next time.